Hey all, it's Erin, and today I wanted to read an article for you. So sometimes I come across an article that explains a particular idea or concept really well, and I find myself sharing that same article over and over with people, and so I thought maybe this is a way that I can share it as well. Share these types of articles, and so that's what I'm going to do today is just to read it. And I would just like to give you some disclaimers to start with. So, to start with, I don't claim to be good at reading or speaking or that I sound good, and I'm probably going to get a bunch of the words wrong and not pronounce them properly, etc. So, that's just a reality we are living with. If there's jump cuts and stuff, it's probably because there was a noise. I'll also put a link to the article itself if you'd like to read the text. And yeah, welcome you to ask questions, etc. And why I'm happy to explain why this is important to me in one of those Q&A videos. So let's begin with the reading. Hope this goes well. So, How Socialism Can Organize Production Without Money by Adam Buick and Pieter Lawrence. Part 1. Labor time accounting or calculation in kind. In 1920, Ludwig von Mises published an article, Die Verschaffung und Sozialisation Gemeinwesen, which was translated into English in 1935 as Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, and published in Collectivist Economic Planning, Critical Studies on the Possibilities of Socialism, edited by Fron Hayek. His basic argument was that socialism would be impossible because without money and prices fixed by the market, society would not be able to do economic calculations rationally. Or as he put it, where there is no free market, there is no pricing mechanism. Without a pricing mechanism, there is no economic calculation. Von Mises defined socialism to mean any system in which the ownership of means of production by private individuals was entirely abolished. His definition thus covered total state capitalism as well as socialism. This makes some of his arguments, insofar as they were meant to be arguments against socialism, irrelevant, but in arguing against the possibility of a moneyless society, he was also arguing against socialism. Von Mises accepted that socialist society would be able to decide what it wanted, but denied that it would be able to work out the most rational way of meeting those wants. It will be evident, even in a socialist society, that 1,000 hectoliters of wine are better than 800, and it is not difficult to decide whether it desires 1,000 hectoliters of wine rather than 500 liters of oil. There is no need for any system of calculation to establish this fact. The deciding element is the will of the economic subjects involved. But once this decision has been taken, the real task of rational economic direction only commences, i.e., economically, to place the means at the service of the end. That can only be done with some kind of economic calculation. The human mind cannot orientate itself properly among the bewildering mass of intermediate products and potentialities of production without such aid. It would simply stand perplexed before the problems of management and location. It is an illusion to imagine that in a socialist state, calculation in natura can take the place of monetary calculation. Calculation in natura in an economy without exchange can embrace consumption goods only. It completely fails when it comes to deal with goods of a higher order, and as soon as one gives up the concepts of a freely established monetary price for goods of a higher order, rational production becomes impossible. Every step that takes us away from private ownership of the means of production and from the use of money also takes us away from rational economics. He did not deny that labor time could theoretically provide an alternative unit of economic calculation, but argued that in practice it would be impossible to establish an accurate labor time unit because of the difficulty of measuring the intensity and skill of different people's labor. The only possible unit of economic calculation, he concluded, was therefore money. This was a powerful criticism which caught the social democratic and Bolshevik thinkers, both defenders of a total state capitalism rather than socialism, it is true, unprepared. There were three possible reactions to von Mises' criticism. Number one, to accept that money would have to continue to be the unit of economic calculation in socialism. Number two, to argue that labor time could be the unit of economic calculation in an economy where neither money nor exchange were present. Number three, to argue that in socialism, calculation in natura, in kind, can take the place of monetary calculation. The Social Democrats, including the Bolsheviks, who were of course Social Democrats up until 1917, tended to have a technocratic conception of socialism, which in practice, as we have already remarked, made them advocates of state capitalism rather than of socialism. As a result, discussion on what should be the unit of calculation in socialism was largely a discussion of what would be the unit of calculation in state capitalism. This meant that in fact the outcome of debate was predictable from the start. The partisans of retaining money, as Kautsky advocated in 1922 as a measure of value of accounting purposes and for calculating exchange ratios, were bound to win, since in the long run this was the only solution compatible with the operation of the capitalist system which they wanted to continue, even though in a statized form. The partisans of accounting in labor time and those of accounting in real physical quantities were never more than marginal, and by the end of the 1920s had disappeared both amongst the Social Democrats and amongst the Bolsheviks. A labor time blueprint. Calculation in labor time was defended by the Social Democratic writer Otto Lichter in his Die Wirtschaftsrechnung in der sozialistischen Gesellschaft, Economic Calculation in Socialist Society, published in Vienna in 1923, in which he argued that this was perfectly feasible as it was already applied under capitalism by accountants to fixed prices and by time and motion experts. Money, he argued, could therefore be abolished in socialism, state capitalism, even for the distribution of consumer goods, which could be distributed directly to consumers in kind in amounts fixed by nutrition and other experts. Otto Neurath, later prominent as a logical positivist philosopher, argued that even labor time accounting would be unnecessary in socialism, state capitalism. In an administrative economy, production plans could be drawn up and executed directly and solely in real physical quantities. The theory of the socialist economy knows only a single economic agent, society, which without profit and loss accounting, without monetary circulation, whether metallic money as now or labor time money, and on the basis of an economic plan, organizes production without using a unit of account and distributes the means of subsistence according to socialist principles. That's Otto Neurath from Wirtschaftsrecht und Naturrechnung from Berlin 1925, page 84. As the last part of this passage indicates, Neurath too argued that consumer goods could be directly allocated to people in kind. An attempt to present an alternative to what they called the state socialism of both the Social Democrats and Bolsheviks was made up by a group of Dutch council communists in the Grundprinzipien communistischer Verteilung und Produktion, Basic Principles of Communist Distribution and Production, published in Berlin in Germany in 1930. The council communists were a group which had supported the Russian Revolution, really believing it to be what, in its propaganda, it said it was, namely a Soviet, the Russian word for council, revolution. Within a few years, however, they realized the error and that Russia was heading rather for state capitalism. They were themselves council communists to distinguish themselves from state communists, such as Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin. The Grundprinzipien outlined a plan for organizing the production and distribution of wealth without money, but on the basis of accounting in units of labor time. They followed Otto Lichter here, but totally rejected the technocratic stature in which he had seen labor time accounting replacing monetary calculation. In its place, they proposed a federation of workers' councils. But when this plan is stripped of its socialist terminology, it turns out to be a scheme for a sort of self-regulating exchange economy, in which money as we know it today would be replaced as the currency by a labor money. In other words, the money prices wages system would continue to exist but would be run by workers' councils and without exploitation. But to believe that an exchange economy could function in the interests of the workers if labor money and labor time accounting were to be used in place of the coins and notes of monetary calculation we know today is to completely misunderstand how capitalism works and to fail into the purest currency crankyism. Calculation in kind, the right answer. In the end, then, it was Otto Neurath, with his view that socialist society could organize the production and distribution of wealth directly and solely in kind, who was on the right track. The only other personality in the social democratic and Bolshevik movements to take this view was Amadeo Bodiga, but not until the 1950s and in a quite different context to the so-called economic calculation controversy sparked off by von Mises in 1920. Bodiga had been the first leader of the Italian Communist Party, but was eased out of his post in 1923 for his leftist views, which had already been denounced by Lenin in his famous pamphlet Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder, and was eventually expelled from the party altogether in 1930, although he himself dropped out of political activity till the fall of Mussolini in 1943. His particular brand of left-wing communism continued to be propagated by a group who came to be called Bodigists. Bodiga did not begin to reflect seriously on the nature of socialism till he was faced with the problem of explaining, after the war, to his followers why Russia was state capitalist and neither socialist nor a worker state. Thus, after commenting that planning in Russia wasn't socialist because the plans there were drawn up in money terms as well as physical quantities, and that in fact, just like in the capitalism analyzed by Marx, these physical quantities had to be converted into money before the productive cycle could begin again. Bodiga went on, if there is accumulation in socialism, it will take the form of accumulation of objects, of materials useful to human needs, and these will have no need to appear alternatively as money, nor to undergo the application of money meter, allowing them to be measured and compared to a general equivalent. Thus, these objects will no longer be commodities and will not longer be defined except by their quantitative physical magnitude and by their qualitative nature, what the economists and Marx also, for explanatory purposes, express by the term use value. That's Amadeo Bodiga, Structure Economique et Sociale de la Russie d'aujourd'hui, Paris, 1975, pages 191 to 2. Elsewhere, he pointed out that, in post-bourgeois society, therefore, it will not be a question of measuring value by labor time, as fools believe, but of finishing altogether with the measurement of value. And the rational relationship between man and nature will be born from the moment when these accounts and these calculations concerning projects are no longer done in money, but in physical and human magnitudes. This is undoubtedly the correct position. Calculation in socialism can only be done directly in physical quantities, without the need for any general equivalency, or any general accounting units, certainly not money, but not labor time either. Basically, socialism does not need any general equivalence. Such a universal unit in which all goods can be expressed is only necessary in an exchange economy, where all goods have to be reduced to some common denominator as a means of determining the proportions in which they exchange for one another. Economic calculation and capitalism. Capitalism is in fact not just an exchange economy, but an exchange economy where the aim of production is to make a profit. This too requires a general equivalent in order to be calculated and measured. Profit is the monetary expression of the difference between the exchange value of a product and the exchange value of the materials, energy, and labor power used to produce it, or what Marx called surplus value. Similarly, the cost of production of a good is the exchange value of other goods, including labor power, used up in its production, while its selling price is the monetary expression of its exchange value. Since, as the classical economists and Marx showed, the exchange value of a product depends on the amount of socially necessary labor incorporated in it from start to finish, the question arises of which calculations cannot be done directly in labor time rather than in money. It is this reflection that is behind all schemes for labor money and labor time accounting. The reason why it is not possible to use labor time as a general equivalent in place of money is that the exchange value of a product does not depend on the actual amount of labor incorporated in that product in the course of its production from start to finish, but on the amount of socially necessary labor incorporated in it, which is by no means the same. Otherwise, an inefficient worker would, because he took more time, produce more value than an efficient worker, but this is not the case. While the actual amount of labor spent on producing a good could theoretically be measured, what labor is socially necessary is a social average, taking into account average techniques, average productivity, average intensity of labor, etc. That can only be established through the social process that is the operation of the market, whose price changes reflect the changes which are continuously taking place in the various factors we have just mentioned, which determine the average. In other words, it is an average that can only be established after a good has been produced. This is why Von was right to say that, under capitalism of course, the only possible unit of economic calculation is money, not labor time. But this point had already been made by Marx when he discussed and dismissed various schemes for labor money in 1859 in his A Critique of Political Economy. No exchange value to measure in socialism. If calculation in labor time is impossible under capitalism, it is simply unnecessary in socialism, since socialism will have no place for the concept of exchange value, of which both money and labor time are proposed as units of measurement. In socialism, goods will not be produced for sale, they will not be commodities, and so will not have any exchange value or price. They will simply be useful things capable of satisfying some human need, or as Bodiga put it, materials useful to human needs, use values. While capitalism is only interested in the exchange value of goods, capitalism is in fact an economic mechanism geared to the accumulation of more and more exchange value. Socialism will only be interested in their use value. Socialism will be a society entirely geared in the field of wealth production to turning out specific useful things which people have indicated they want to live and enjoy life. Under these circumstances, calculations concerning the production and distribution of wealth will of course still be necessary, but these can be done exclusively in units to measure specific amounts of kinds of different goods. Units such as kilos, liters, square meters, watts, even hours. There will be no need for any general equivalents by which to measure and compare all goods. In other words, calculation in socialism will not be economic but technical. In socialism, calculations will be done directly in physical quantities of real things, in use values, without any general unit of calculation. Needs will be communicated to productive units as requests for specific useful things, while productive units will communicate their requirements to their suppliers as requests for other useful things, and how this might work is outlined in the following article. Adam Buick. The second part, by Pieter Lawrence, Economic Calculation versus Production for Use. Defenders of capitalism never seem to ask themselves the practical question about what is the critical factor determining a production initiative in a market system, and moreover, what is the function of a cost-price calculation in relation to that initiative? The answer is obvious from everyday experience. The factor which critically decides the production of commodities is the judgment that enterprises make about whether they can be sold in the market. Obviously, consumers buy in the market what they perceive as being for their needs, but whether or not the transaction takes place is not decided by needs but by ability to pay. So the realization of profit in the market determines both the production of goods and also the distribution of goods by various enterprises. In the market system, the motive of production, the organization of production, and the distribution of goods are inseparable parts of the same economic process, the realization of profit and the accumulation of capital. There is no choice about this. Commodity production is organized within the constraints of the circulation of capital. This capital can accumulate, maintain its level, or become depleted. The economic pressure on capital is that of accumulation. The alternative is bankruptcy. The production and distribution of goods is entirely subordinate to the pressure on capital to accumulate. Therefore, the practical technical organization of production is entirely separate from the economic organization of the accumulation of capital, in which cost, price, value factors play a vital part. The economic signals of the market are not signals to produce useful things, they signal the prospects of profit and capital accumulation. If there is a profit to be made, then the production will take place. If there is no prospect of profit, then production will not take place. Profit, not need, is the deciding factor. Calculating exploitation. The real function of economic calculation in the market system is not to facilitate the practical, technical organization of production. It is ultimately about calculating the exploitation of labor. The market system, involving the circulation of capital, generates commodity values which are brought into relationship of exchange in the market, so that value, surplus to the value of labor power, embodied in commodities, is realized through sales. When enterprises calculate costs as relationship of labor time to output, this is not with a view to passing on socially useful information about the organization of production. They are calculating costs plus the average rate of profit. Through the exchange of labor power for wages, capital is invested in the power of workers to produce goods. It is with active labor functioning as deployed capital that capital expands. Labor power generates more values than it consumes. These surplus values belong to the enterprise in the material form of commodities, which are then sold in the market. This is where capital realizes its self-expansion and thereby accumulates. The market price of commodities produced must exceed the price of the materials and labor power required to produce them. This is what costing is all about, and it has nothing to do with the practical organization of production. In its overall effect, the subordination of useful production to the accumulation of capital distorts and constrains social production. The market is at every point in the system a barrier of exchange between production, distribution, and social needs. The circulation of capital confines useful labor within a self-enclosed system of exchange. Labor is activated by an exchange of labor power for wages, and this is determined by the capacity of the market to provide profit through sales. Economic calculation is not part of the technical organization of production. It is an indispensable part of the accumulation of capital, whether this takes place within the free market or under the system of state capitalism. What socialism will establish is a practical system of world production operating directly and solely for human needs. Socialism will be concerned solely with the production, distribution, and consumption of useful goods and services in response to definite needs. It will integrate social needs with the material means of meeting those needs, that is to say, with active production. Under capitalism, what appears to be production decisions are in fact decisions to go for profit in the market. Socialism will make economically unencumbered production decisions as a direct response to needs. With production for use, then, the starting point will be needs. Quantities of material things. Socialism will not depend on calculations of labor time or the conversion of those into costs, since production will not be generating exchange values for the market. Production for use will generate useful goods and services directly for need, and this will require not economic calculation, but the communication of quantities of material things throughout production. This will result from the change in productive relationships. The use of labor in a market system begins with an exchange of labor power for wages, which is an economic exchange between individual workers and invested capital. This will be replaced by direct cooperation between producers to satisfy social needs in the material form of productive activity. Modern production embraces activity across the world as a network of productive links. It consists of decisions and actions by individuals, small groups, and large organizations. Many of these dispersed activities interact with each other and alter the pattern of the whole. Modern production can only operate on the basis of particular production units being self-adjusting to social requirements in response to information being communicated to them. Socialism would take over existing world production, which is generally structured on 3 scales. Socialism could rationalize this world structure on a decentralized basis, which could operate in the most efficient way through a world, regional, and local structure. Extraction and processing of basic materials such as metals, oil, coal, and some agricultural products, etc., could be organized as world production with distribution to regions and localities. These materials could be taken up by the regions for the production and assembly of component parts of machinery, equipment, and goods for distribution to localities within a region. This regional organization could include the extraction and supply of those materials which could be contained within that region. A regional tractor producing plant could take its material from world supply and then distribute tractors down to the localities within that region. On the smaller scale, but nevertheless extremely important, local production units could be producing local goods for local consumption and use. This need not be a rigid arrangement, but an adaptable skeleton structure operating in these 3 world, regional, and local scales. These would represent the general scales of productive organization, through which required quantities of material goods could be communicated between production units. Direct responses to needs. Production for use could work with the basic structures outlined above. It would operate in direct response to need. These would arise in local communities expressed as required quantities such as grams, kilos, tons, liters, meters, cubic meters, etc. of various materials and quantities of goods. These would then be communicated as required elements of productive activity as a technical sequence to different scales of social production according to necessity. Each particular part of production would be responding to the material requirements communicated to it through the connected ideas of social production. It would be self-regulating because each element of production would be self-adjusting to the communication of these material requirements. Each part of production would know its position. If requirements are low in relation to a buildup of stock, then this would be an automatic indication to a production unit that its production should be reduced. If requirements are high in relation to stock, then this would be an automatic indication that its production should be increased. The register of needs and the communication of every necessary element of those needs to the structure of production would be clear and readily known. The supply of some needs will take place within the local community, and in those cases, production would not extend beyond this, as for example with local food production for local consumption. Other needs could be communicated as required things to the regional organization of production. Local food production would require glass, but not every local community could have its own glassworks. The requirement for glass could be communicated to a regional glassworks. These could be definite quantities of required glass. The glassworks has its own supply of materials, and the amounts they require for the production of 1 ton of glass are known in definite quantities. The required quantities of these materials could then be passed by the glassworks to the regional supplier of the materials for glass manufacture. This would be a sequence of communication of local needs to the regional organization of production, and thus contained within a region. Local food production would also require tractors, and here the communication of required quantities of things could extend further to the world organization of production. Regional manufacture could produce and assemble the component parts of tractors for distribution to local communities. These would be required in a definite number, and on the basis of this definite number of final products, the definite number of component parts for tractors would also be known. The regional production unit producing tractors would communicate these definite quantities to their own suppliers, and eventually this would extend to the world production units extracting and processing the necessary materials. This would be the self-regulating system of production for need, operating on the basis of communication of needs as definite quantities of things throughout the structure of production. Each production unit would convert the requirements communicated to it into its own material requirements and pass these on to its own suppliers. This would be the sequence by which every element of labor required for the production of a final product would be known. This system of self-regulating production for use is achieved through communications. Socialism would make full use of the means of communication which have been developed. These include not only transport such as roads, railways, shipping, etc., they also include the existing system of electronic communications, which provide for instant, worldwide contact, as well as facilities for storing and processing millions of pieces of information. Modern information technology could be used by socialism to integrate any required combination of different parts of its world structure of production. In whose interest? Defenders of the market such as von Mises and Hayek appear not to understand the system which they represent, but this is not simply a matter of them putting forward fallacious assertions as a matter of ignorance. Their position is based on a crude defense of the privileged interests which do benefit from capitalism. In arguing in favor of these interests, it appears that any nonsense which defies the reality of experience will do. Their more honest position would be that the market system does work, but for those who monopolize the means of living, and that therefore economic calculation of the exploitation of labor is indispensable in pursuit of that interest. The interest which socialists pursue is fundamentally different. Socialism stands for the interest of all workers, the wage and salaried working class on whose skills and energies the material running of society depends. But we also emphasize that the political victory of labor over capital through socialist action will result in a society which will work in the interest of the whole of mankind without distinction of race or sex. Pieter Lawrence. This article originally appeared in issue 2 of the World Socialist and was written in 1984. So, hopefully that was something that you could understand what I was saying vocally, and hopefully the ideas that are in this article were interesting to you and that it gave you something to think about. I really love this article because when I read it, it was the first time that a socialist economy really clicked for me, and I understood why money would be completely irrelevant, and that in fact that money is already irrelevant to everything except accumulation of wealth by the rich. So anyway, thank you very much for listening or watching, whatever. I will get back to some more everyday type language, don't worry, but I do want to put these articles out there now and then because I think they are just really well written, and the ideas in them I think need to get more attention. So that'll be it for today. Hope you have a good day.